Hello friends. In the comments, you have often asked me to make a video about async and wait. So now we will discuss how they work and how to use them. And to start, let's implement the following task. It might not be very practical, but it will be very illustrative. We will initially create a function that will return a promise and will introduce some artificial delay. We already know how to do this because there was a previous video about promises. So to start, I create a function, for example, delay, and it will be an arrow function that takes a certain number of milliseconds. Next, it will return a new promise, that is, return new promise to the constructor of which we pass the resolve function, or I'll just call it R, and then using the setTimeout function, we set a certain delay. In the callback, we will call the resolve function if the timeout completes successfully, after the milliseconds we pass to the function. So, the delay function itself looks like this, and we can easily test it by writing, for example, delay for 2 seconds. Considering that this is a promise, we now have access to the then method, and here we can log something to the console. For example, console.log 2 seconds, such as, if we look in the browser, after 2 seconds, we will get the message 2 seconds. This means everything is working correctly, and our delay function is successfully built. Now, let's move on to the next task. Suppose we want to make an asynchronous request to the server and get some data, but also add an artificial delay to it, in order to build a chain of promises. To demonstrate working with the server through AJAX requests using the XML HTTP request protocol, we can visit the site JSON-placeholder.typecode. That is, you can simply type JSON placeholder in Google, and the first link will lead to the address typecode.com. This is a service that provides us with a fake online REST API for testing or prototyping purposes. It responds very quickly. And let's see how to use it. Actually, what data we use here is not that important. So there is an example field. And from there I will copy this URL, which allows us to fetch some to-do. So here I can, for example, create a variable URL and assign to it as a string value the URL that we copied from the site. And then I will basically create a function, let's say, which I will call fetch to-dos. And to start, we will add a slight small artificial delay. That is, suppose here I will call the delay function with a value of, for example, 2 seconds. And then using the then method, I will specify that when the given delay is over, I will execute the next callback, where I want to make a request to the server. And in order to make a request to the server using a promise, we can use the native browser functionality called fetch. So, fetch is somewhat like an analog of AJAX, which makes an asynchronous request and returns a promise, making it very convenient to work with. And we will perform the fetch using the URL that we copied from the site, that is, our constant URL. Considering that this method returns a promise, we can also use the then method here. Here, we will receive some response. And then, in order to get the JSON that comes from the server, we need to call a method on the response object called JSON. That is, it is some kind of API that is present in the fetch method. But here, considering that we are working inside promises, we don't need to create such nesting. Instead of writing this then here, I can cut it out. Here I can return a new promise, meaning I am taking advantage of the benefits of promises. And then the upper promise subsequently calls the then method and parse it response. And let's say I can return this entire promise from the fetch to-dos function. So this is the logic we have. And how do we use it now? Essentially, we can call the fetch to-dos method. It doesn't take any parameters, but now it has a then method available where some data will arrive. Let's log it to the console, say data. And here I pass the data. Moreover, in promises, we have the catch method available to handle potential errors. So I will log any potential error to console. Error. And let's do one more thing. When we start fetching something, I will log a message to the console. Let's say, fetch to-do started. Okay, saving. Now if I refresh the page, we get the message fetch to-do started. And after 2 seconds, and a slight delay, we get the message data. where we see a large array consisting of 200 elements, each represented as a todo, meaning it has certain fields. But in the current task, we are not very interested in this. As you can see, we have implemented similar logic, and it looks quite good, considering that we are using promises. This means we avoid unnecessary nesting. By the way, we can further reduce the code by writing it this way, because this is ES6 syntax, and by default, if we do not write return, JavaScript automatically returns the result for us. So here, we will get the same result. Great. And as you can see, in principle, it is very convenient to work with all this. But thanks to the new async and await operators in JavaScript, we can make this approach even more comfortable. And let me demonstrate how. I will comment out these two methods so that you have something to compare with right now, currently. And now we will create a function that will do the same thing, but using async and await. So I am creating a new function. Let's say, for example, I call it fetch async todos in our code, or something similar. And the first point we need to understand is that the functions which use the await operator inside must be asynchronous. That is, if we want to work with asynchronous code in the new format, we must make the function in which we perform some logic async. That is, write the async field here. I will explain how it works a bit later. For now, just remember that if we use the await operator inside a function, which makes us wait for some promises, the function in which we do this must be asynchronous. Specifically, it must be a top-level function. So, what do we do next? First of all, we need to wait for our artificial delay, meaning we call the delay function with a value of 2000 milliseconds, and we know that this function returns a promise. So, you see here that we use the then method on it. But considering that our function is now asynchronous, instead of handling this promise with the then method, we can use the await operator here. And in fact, this will be equivalent to handling the promise. Now, in the next line, we can execute some logic. And the important point is that we will not move to this line until the given promise is resolved, meaning until the given promise is completed. This is exactly the function that the await operator performs. What do we need to do next? Next, we need to call the fetch method and pass it a certain URL, which we have stored in a constant. But we also know that the fetch method returns a promise, so we also use the then method with it. The evade operator allows us to automatically handle this promise, so here we write evade, but the fetch method returns some response, which goes into the then method, and here is where the difference in the notation lies. If we apply the evade operator, we simply get this response object into a regular variable as a result of the await operator and the fetch promise. Next, we need to execute another promise, which is the response JSON method. It also returns a promise, so we need to await it. And we do it exactly the same way. That is, we get the data object from the response method, where we call the JSON method. And in fact, we have now completely repeated all the previous logic. So, let me copy the console.log to make it clear as well. And here we will output the data to console.log. However, we should not forget the fact that we have defined the function fetch async todos, but we need to call it for it to work. So, we call fetch async todos, and that's basically it. Now I refresh the page. We get a message, and after 2 seconds we see the same result. But now you can notice how much more concise and understandable this function is written. That is, there are no internal callbacks here that we pass to the then method. It's as if we are programming synchronous code now. But thanks to the presence of the await operator, it allows not to move to the next line until the promise on the current line is fulfilled. You might also ask me, what about the catch method? Because promises have a catch method and a finally method. What should we do when we use asynchronous functions? Actually, in fact, it's very, very simple. In JavaScript, there are keywords such as try and catch. Therefore, to handle potential errors, we enclose the block where the await operator is present in try and catch. Try to handle it here using the catch keyword effectively. Next, we move the logic into the try block, and if something goes wrong at any stage, we will automatically end up in the catch method, where we can log an error to the console with the value E. Now, if we refresh the page, we won't see any difference. Again, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the code looks much more concise and elegant with this approach. You might also ask me about the finally method. In JavaScript, the try and catch operators also have a finally block, which will execute regardless of whether an error occurred. So, you can make use of this. Now, let's talk about how all of this actually works. Because initially, JavaScript did not have operators like async and await, and everything was built on callbacks. And this approach was introduced to us by Babel, the transpiler that allows us to implement some features that are only available in an experimental format in JavaScript at this stage. And in fact, when Babel encounters such code and sees the async and await operators, it wraps all of it in promises. That is exactly why we definitely add the async keyword to the function. That is, later, when all this is transformed into promises, there will, of course, be much more code written here, and we will see something similar to what we did before. In other words, the async await operator is actually there to make development easier for us. And as a result of this being moved to promises, at least until it is fully included in the JavaScript specification and available in all browsers, a function that is asynchronous will always return a promise. That is, in this case, we can actually call the then method on the fetch async todos function. And this then will be executed when the last evade operator completes. So, let's basically summarize everything we just talked about essentially. In essence, async and await are syntactic sugar that allows us to program asynchronous tasks more conveniently. In order to use the await operator, which handles and waits for the completion of a promise, all we need to do is to use the async prefix with the parent function, and it must always be with the parent function. Next, we use the await operator before a promise, and the result that goes into the then method can simply be synchronously assigned to a variable. And as you can see, we are getting rid of various callbacks here, which makes our code more pleasant.